And that, my dear students, is why the gaseous giants of the Andromeda sector are completely uninhabitable, unless you happen to be a sentient cloud of methane. Professor Zalthar's tentacles waved with enthusiasm as scattered laughter echoed through the lecture hall. The professor's iridescent scales shifted from their usual scholarly purple to a more relaxed blue as he surveyed the classroom. 300 of the galaxy's brightest young minds sat before him, representing nearly every advanced species in the known universe. Well, 299 of the brightest young aliens, and one human. Now then he clapped two of his 4 hands together. Today's discussion will focus on planetary classification and adaptation. Each of you will share something fascinating about your home world that has shaped your species' evolution. A gentle hum of excitement filled the air quite literally, as the Melodians in the front row vibrated with anticipation. Professor Zalthar's gaze swept across the amphitheater, taking in the diverse array of students. There were the crystalline Luminians who sparkled under the Academy's artificial sunlight, the gaseous nebulons contained within their environment suits, and even a group of telepathic mindweavers who somehow managed to look bored in 5 dimensions simultaneously. Let's start with Student Bloomra. The professor pointed to a tall, willowy being whose skin had the texture of rose petals. Tell us about the atmospheric conditions of your homeworld. The Floravian student rose gracefully, her leaf-like hair rustling. The air pressure on Verdant Prime is 3 times standard galactic units, with a humidity level of 98%. These conditions are essential for maintaining our cellular rigidity and... She continued explaining the intricacies of her planet's climate with obvious pride. Professor Zalthar nodded approvingly as various students took turns. The Aquarians described their underwater cities, the silicon-based life forms detailed their volcanic homes, and the energy beings explained how they harvested power from their binary star system. Then his gaze fell on the human student sitting quietly in the middle row. Maya Bennett looked almost painfully ordinary compared to her exotic classmates. No extra limbs, no bioluminescence, not even basic psychic abilities. Just the standard bipedal form with 5-fingered hands and that strange fur patch on top called hair. She sat there taking notes with an archaic stylus and paper, claiming she preferred the analog experience. Student Bennett, Professor Zalthar called out, his scales shifting to an encouraging shade of green. Perhaps you'd like to share something about Earth? Most of us are quite unfamiliar with your home planet, as it's rather off the beaten path, so to speak. The human looked up, and the professor noticed that strange expression humans called a smile spreading across her face. It still unnerved him slightly. Showing teeth was a sign of aggression in many species, after all. But he'd learned it was meant to be friendly in humans. Of course, Professor Maya said, standing up. Though I should warn you, Earth isn't quite what most people expect. Excellent. Excellent, Professor Zalthar's tentacles curled with academic enthusiasm. Do tell us about your atmospheric composition or perhaps your planet's gravity? I understand it's somewhat higher than standard. Maya's smile widened just a fraction. Actually, Professor, I think it might be more interesting to start with why Earth is classified as a Category 12 Deathworld. The lecture hall fell silent. Even the Melodians stopped humming. Professor Zalthar's scales involuntarily flashed warning orange for a moment before he composed himself. Surely he'd heard wrong. Category 12? That was impossible. This ordinary-looking creature couldn't possibly. I'm sorry, Student Bennett, he managed to say, his voice carefully neutral. Did you say Category 12? Yes, Professor Maya replied cheerfully. Would you like me to explain why? A snort echoed from the back of the lecture hall. Please. A Category 12? That's clearly a clerical error. The voice belonged to Crix, a burly Centaurian whose 4 muscular arms were crossed in obvious skepticism. Everyone knows humans come from some backwater farming world. They don't even have natural armor. Professor Zalthar noticed Maya's smile didn't waver. If anything, it grew more pronounced. He felt his scales beginning to prickle. Actually, Maya said, pulling out her datapad, I brought some visuals. May I use the holoprojector, Professor? He gestured consent with a tentacle, watching as she connected her device to the classroom's systems. The air above the central platform shimmered as a three-dimensional image of Earth materialized. Now, as you can see, Earth appears quite peaceful from space. Blue oceans, white clouds, green and brown landmasses. Pretty standard, right? Maya's voice took on an almost musical quality. But let's talk about what's happening on the surface. First, the crust of our planet is broken into massive pieces that constantly move and crash into each other. You mean your planet isn't stable? A Luminian student's crystalline form vibrated with concern. Oh, not at all. These tectonic plates, as we call them, always moving. Sometimes they collide violently, causing what we call earthquakes. Entire cities can be damaged when this happens. Maya manipulated the display, showing footage of buildings swaying and ground rippling like water. This one was actually quite mild, only a 6.5 on our Richter scale. Professor Zalthar noticed several students edge away from Maya's position. His own scales were starting to shift toward worry purple. But that's not even the interesting part, Maya continued, clearly warming to her subject. See these points where the plates meet? Sometimes they create mountains that literally explode. The hologram shifted to show a volcano erupting. Several gaseous students condensed in shock. We call these volcanoes. They spew molten rock at temperatures hot enough to vaporize most life forms instantly. We have thousands of them. Some are even under our oceans. Isn't that fascinating? Under the oceans, a horrified whisper came from the Aquarian section. Oh yes, but let's talk about our weather system. You see, our planet's atmosphere is remarkably unstable. We regularly experience storms with winds strong enough to lift buildings. Maya's fingers danced across her datapad, showing footage of hurricanes and tornadoes. Sometimes we even get storms that throw bolts of plasma from the sky. Lightning. Professor Zalthar found himself explaining weakly to his stunned class. They call them lightning storms. Exactly, Maya beamed at him. And in some regions we get frozen water falling from the sky with enough force to dent metallic surfaces. We call that hail, though that's really only dangerous during the warm seasons. Warm seasons. Bloomra's petals had closed tightly against her body. Of course. Our planet's axial tilt means we experience dramatic temperature variations throughout our solar orbit. Some regions go from scorching heat to freezing cold in a matter of days. We've had temperature swings of 50 degrees in under 24 hours. A Mindweaver student actually fainted, their fifth-dimensional form collapsing with a soft pop. But surely, Crix interjected, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence, surely your species lives in the stable regions of your world. Maya's laugh sent chills down Professor Zalthar's spine. Oh no, humans live everywhere on Earth. In the frozen wastes, in the burning deserts, in the depths of the oceans, even in orbit around our planet. We build cities right next to active volcanoes, in tornado zones and on major fault lines. One of our largest cities, Tokyo, experiences hundreds of earthquakes every year. The residents barely notice anymore. The lecture hall had grown so quiet that Professor Zalthar could hear the soft hum of the environmental systems. His scales had settled into a sickly shade of gray as he processed this information. Student Bennett, he managed to say, are you suggesting that your species considers these conditions normal? Maya looked genuinely puzzled for a moment. Well, yes, how else would they be? Though I haven't even gotten to the really dangerous parts yet. There's more. The question escaped Professor Zalthar's mouth before he could stop himself. Oh my, yes, Maya's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Should I tell you about our wildlife next? Like the microorganisms that live inside us, or the predators we keep as pets, or maybe our planet's oxygen content that's toxic to most carbon-based life forms. The second Mindweaver student fainted. Professor Zalthar cleared his throat, trying to maintain some semblance of academic decorum. Perhaps, Student Bennett, you could clarify what you mean about microorganisms living inside you. Well, Maya adjusted her datapad, bringing up a new set of images that made several students recoil. Humans have evolved alongside billions of microscopic organisms. They live in our digestive systems, on our skin, pretty much everywhere. We call it our microbiome. Most of them are beneficial, but some can be deadly if they get out of control. That's why we have an internal defense system that's constantly at war with potential invaders. War Professor Zalthar's scales rippled with alarm. Inside your bodies. Exactly. Our immune system attacks anything it considers foreign. Sometimes it even attacks itself by mistake. We call those autoimmune diseases. Maya's enthusiasm seemed to grow with each horrified gasp from her classmates. But that's just the tiny stuff. Want to hear about our larger wildlife? No, squeaked a silicon-based student, their crystalline structure vibrating with fear. But Maya was already updating the holographic display. This is what we call a honey badger, she said, showing footage of a small but ferocious creature tearing into what appeared to be a protective shelter. They're actually considered quite cute by human standards. They've been known to fight off lions, which are much larger predators. Speaking of which, the display shifted to show a massive feline creature with razor-sharp teeth. This is a lion, one of our apex predators. Though honestly, they're not even close to being our most dangerous animals. That would probably be the hippopotamus, which looks harmless but kills hundreds of people every year. Or maybe the mosquitoes that spread diseases, or the box jellyfish whose venom can kill in minutes, or possibly the Brazilian wandering spider whose bite can cause, among other things, painful. Thank you, student Bennett. Professor Zalthar interrupted hastily, noticing several students turning interesting shades of distress. Perhaps we could focus on less venomous aspects of your world. Sure. Let's talk about our oceans then. They cover most of our planet, and they're full of fascinating creatures, like the great white shark, which can smell blood from miles away and has multiple rows of serrated teeth, or the giant squid that hunts in the darkness of the deep ocean, or the orcas that play with their food before eating it. They're actually quite intelligent. We call them killer whales. Bloomra's petals had completely closed now, and she was slowly sliding under her desk. The Aquarian students had moved as far from the holographic display as possible, their water-filled environment suits clouding with anxiety. But surely Crick spoke up again, his voice now barely a whisper. Surely these creatures avoid human settlements. Maya laughed again, that bright sound that now sent shivers through the entire lecture hall. Not at all. We actually go looking for them. Humans love to study dangerous animals up close. We have these places called zoos where we keep them for entertainment and education. Some humans even keep predators as pets. My family has 2 cats. They're smaller relatives of those lions I showed you earlier. They sleep on my bed. A collective shudder ran through the classroom. Professor Zalthar noticed that several students were surreptitiously checking the distance to the emergency exits. But what I find really interesting is how humans have adapted to all this. Maya continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing panic. Our bones are incredibly dense to cope with our high gravity. We have redundant organs, rapid healing capabilities, and we can survive the loss of entire limbs under the right circumstances. Our endurance is off the charts compared to most species. We used to hunt prey by literally chasing them until they collapsed from exhaustion. We call it persistence hunting. Used to. Professor Zalthar found himself asking, dreading the answer. Oh, some humans still do it for fun. We call it jogging or marathon running now. Speaking of fun activities, let me tell you about our extreme sports. That's where we deliberately put ourselves in dangerous situations for entertainment, like climbing frozen waterfalls, jumping out of flying vehicles, or swimming with those sharks I mentioned earlier. The third Mindweaver student popped out of existence entirely, presumably seeking refuge in a safer dimension. And the really fascinating part is how we've adapted mentally. Maya's eyes were shining now. Humans can eat almost anything through something we call acquired taste. We actively seek out substances that cause pain responses in our nervous systems. We call them spices, and we love them. We've even developed this thing called adrenaline addiction, where we crave dangerous situations. Some humans find potentially lethal activities relaxing. Professor Zalthar watched in horrified fascination as his star pupil, Bloomra, began to photosynthesize anxiously, her leaves producing stress nectar. Would you believe that some of us deliberately trigger our fight or flight response for entertainment? We call them horror movies. We gather in dark rooms to watch simulations of our worst fears. And speaking of fears, let me tell you about something we call roller coasters. Student Bennett, Professor Zalthar interrupted, his scales now a distinct shade of worried mauve. These claims about human capabilities seem rather extraordinary. Perhaps a practical demonstration would help verify some of these assertions. Maya's face lit up in a way that made several nearby students lean back. Of course, Professor. What would you like me to demonstrate first? The professor glanced around the room, his tentacles twisting nervously. Well, student Crix here is our academy's top athlete. Perhaps a simple strength comparison. Crix stood up, his forearms flexing unconsciously. Despite his earlier skepticism, he now looked less than enthusiastic about approaching the human. Professor, I don't think. Excellent idea. Maya bounced down the steps to the demonstration area. How should we do this? Arm wrestling. Though I suppose you have an advantage with the extra arms. How about a lifting contest? Professor Zalthar gestured toward the classroom's environmental testing chamber. We use this for studying various planetary conditions. It can simulate different gravitational fields. Perfect. Maya stepped into the chamber, followed by a reluctant Crix. Let's start with something simple. Could you set it to Earth standard gravity? The professor adjusted the controls, and immediately Crix's knees buckled slightly. By the void. This is your normal gravity. Oh yes. Actually, it's a bit lighter than I'm used to. I grew up in the mountains where the gravity is slightly stronger. Maya did a few quick stretches, seemingly unaffected. Now, what should we lift? Professor Zalthar programmed the chamber to generate a standard test weight. A metal bar materialized, hovering slightly above the ground. This is calibrated to 100 standard galactic weight units. Crix gripped the bar with all four hands and lifted. His muscles strained, but he managed to raise it to chest height. The class applauded politely. Maya nodded appreciatively. Nice. Mind if I try? She gripped the bar with just two hands and lifted it smoothly above her head. This is fun. Could we add more weight? The professor, scales now flickering between disbelief green and concern purple, gradually increased the weight. Maya continued lifting, apparently without strain, until Crix asked to be excused from the chamber. But we haven't even gotten to the endurance test yet, Maya called after him. Though I suppose 4-hour lifting sessions might be a bit much for a quick demonstration. 4 hours, Professor Zalthar managed to ask. Sure, that's a normal gym session back home. Though I usually mix it up with some cardio. Want to see how long I can run at full speed? Humans have this neat thing called sweat that lets us regulate our temperature indefinitely. We can basically run forever as long as we have water and nutrients. Perhaps, the professor suggested weakly, you could demonstrate your healing capabilities instead. Oh, right. Maya pulled a small object from her pocket. Several students screamed as she deliberately pricked her finger with it, causing a drop of red blood to appear. Don't worry. Watch this. The entire class leaned forward, morbidly fascinated, as she explained the clotting process in real time. See how the blood is already coagulating? The wound will be completely sealed in minutes. By tomorrow, you won't even be able to tell I was injured. We can regrow skin, heal broken bones, and even regenerate some organs. Would you like to see my appendectomy scar? That's from when they removed a redundant organ that was trying to kill me. No, the unified cry came from the entire class, including Professor Zalthar. Well, how about I demonstrate our temperature tolerance instead? Humans can survive in conditions ranging from well below freezing to hot enough to cook most proteins. We even have these places called saunas where we go to deliberately overheat ourselves for fun. Or I could show you how long I can hold my breath underwater. The current human record is over 20 minutes. Professor Zalthar noticed that the number of students near the emergency exits had doubled. Perhaps we should move on to the theoretical portion of today's lesson. Sure. Did you know humans can process multiple types of poisons for pleasure? We call them alcohol and caffeine. We drink them every day. Speaking of which, is it okay if I have my morning coffee? It's a stimulant that we're all mildly addicted to. The sight of Maya casually pulling out a thermos of hot, black liquid was apparently too much for the remaining Mindweaver student, who promptly shifted into the sixth dimension and disappeared. News spread through the Galactic Academy of Advanced Species faster than a plasma burst. By lunch period, the cafeteria had created a special human-safe section, complete with warning signs about the dangerous substances humans consumed. Maya found herself eating alone at a table marked with hazard symbols, cheerfully munching on what she called a peanut butter sandwich apparently containing a substance that could be lethal to some humans. Professor Zal-Thar sat in the faculty lounge, his scales still unable to settle on a single color. Dean Nexus had called an emergency staff meeting after receiving 17 formal complaints, 32 requests for transfer to non-human classes, and one demand for a campus-wide human containment protocol. Surely you understand our concerns. Professor Dean Nexus's floating energy form pulsed with agitation, having a Category-12 species wandering freely around campus. Student Bennett has shown no aggressive tendencies, Professor Zal-Thar pointed out, though his tentacles curled nervously around his cup of calming tea. In fact, she's one of our most courteous students. She drinks poison for breakfast. Professor Quantum, the physics teacher, exploded in a burst of quantum particles, and apparently enjoys it. I heard she sleeps for 8 hours every night, whispered Professor Flux, the temporal mechanics instructor, voluntarily entering an unconscious state, completely vulnerable to predators. Actually, Professor Zal-Thar found himself saying, humans call it a power nap if it's less than an hour. They do it to recharge. The faculty lounge erupted in horrified murmurs. Meanwhile, the Academy's information networks were buzzing with new human safety protocols. Students began wearing environmental monitors to detect human-tolerable levels of radiation, toxins, and other hazards. The Academy's artificial intelligence had to be rebooted after attempting to calculate the probability matrix of all possible ways a human could survive on campus. Professor Zal-Thar watched as Maya walked between classes, surrounded by a growing bubble of space as other students maintained what they considered a safe distance. She seemed completely unfazed, occasionally waving at her terrified classmates and offering what she called friendly smiles. The breaking point came during the afternoon study period when Maya sneezed. The resulting evacuation of the library would later be described as remarkably orderly, considering the circumstances. The fact that 3 different species evolved flight capabilities on the spot was duly noted in the Xenobiology Department's research archives. As Professor Zal-Thar sat in his office that evening, updating his lesson plans to include warning labels, Maya knocked on his door. "Professor," she said, poking her head in, "I hope I haven't caused too much trouble. Humans are actually mostly peaceful. We only use our capabilities for defense, scientific research, and recreational activities." Recreational. Professor Zal-Thar's scales shifted to a new shade of gray he didn't know he could produce. "Student Bennett, yesterday I saw you in the gym, lifting weights that would crush most species, while watching something called a horror movie, and drinking a beverage that was literally dissolving the cup it was in." "Oh, you mean my pre-workout shake? That was just the citric acid. It's perfectly safe. Well, unless you're sensitive to caffeine, taurine, beta-alanine, creatine, or any of the other supplements. But those just give you a nice tingly feeling." The professor's tentacles involuntarily coiled into protective spirals. "I believe the Academy Board is updating our safety protocols as we speak." "That's probably wise," Maya nodded seriously. "Especially since my younger sister is applying for next semester. She's really into extreme sports." Professor Zal-Thar's scales went completely white. As Maya turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Oh, and Professor? Thanks for being so understanding. A lot of species get weird about humans once they learn about us. I mean, the Regellians banned us from their sector just because we mentioned we occasionally eat things that are still alive. Can you believe that?" As her footsteps faded down the corridor, Professor Zal-Thar stared at his class roster for the next semester. Perhaps it was time to consider teaching a less dangerous subject. Antimatter physics, maybe, or black hole navigation. 1 month later, the Galactic Academy of Advanced Species unveiled its new human integration protocol. The list of regulations covered everything from reinforced furniture to emergency environmental shields. The campus AI had been upgraded to include constant monitoring for what it termed normal human behavior anomalies. Notable additions to the student handbook included: all campus sporting events must include a human handicap factor of 500%. Dining facilities must be equipped with universal antidotes. Warning signs must be posted before any human engages in what they call laughter. Emergency teleporters installed in all classrooms for rapid evacuation during human yawning episodes. Maya found it all quite amusing as she went about her daily routine. She would start her mornings with a light workout, only using half the academy's maximum weight settings out of courtesy. Then she would enjoy her breakfast of survival rations, which the cafeteria staff insisted on handling with hazmat equipment. Between classes, she noticed the new warning signs that appeared whenever she walked down a corridor. Caution: human in motion. Be advised they can maintain this activity for multiple planetary rotations. The Academy's medical bay had even created a special human incidents wing, though so far it had only been used once, when Maya mentioned she could dislocate her thumb at will. The resulting panic had caused 3 different species to spontaneously develop additional fight or flight responses. On this particular day, as Professor Zalthar concluded his final class, he watched Maya pack up her things while casually mentioning to a classmate that humans had something called a gag reflex that they could train themselves to suppress. The professor's scales shifted through several warning colors before settling on a resigned shade of blue. He had finally understood something fundamental about humans: they looked deceptively harmless precisely because they had no need to look threatening. When your species could drink acid for enjoyment, bench press a small vehicle for sport, and survive in conditions that would liquefy most carbon-based life forms, you didn't need to evolve intimidating features. As he watched Maya leave class while humming something she called a death metal song, Professor Zalthar made a final note in his xenobiology records: humans, the galaxy's most remarkable paradox. A species so naturally terrifying that they had to evolve to appear non-threatening simply to avoid causing mass panic wherever they went. Warning: under no circumstances should you ask them about their recreational activities. Maya's voice drifted back from the corridor. Hey, Professor. Looking forward to next semester's advanced survival class. I'm bringing my rock climbing gear to demonstrate human grip strength. Professor Zalthar's scales went completely transparent for the first time in his life. Perhaps the black hole navigation course wasn't such a bad idea after all.